Hey people, it's time for the walkthrough of The Descent by me from my album The Poison Act 1. Let's just get right into it. Here we are in the beautiful project that is a little bit messy. Not too bad, just a little. It's fine. Let's just start at the beginning and go away from there, which for this track is very appropriate since it's kind of like a track that keeps on growing and growing. First of all, I did start the track at this point where or at this point where we have this. This is where I started composing the track. And then later on, when I got to the climax bit that you may know from the track, that's where I had this melody that mostly followed the chords. It's not too much of a melody, but I think technically it's a melody. It's just a very minimalistic, simple one that I wanted to introduce into the intro because that really helped to kind of give it some cohesion and to tell the story, because it felt like you were starting in the middle of the track. So that's sometimes I just go back and change those things. It's part of the composing process. Just see what makes sense in the overall structure of the track, and this just felt right to me. I started here because I wanted to start with the big descent into madness, which certainly is something that I explored. Let's just start with this. There's a very minimalistic piano here going on. Just open chords and single notes. So yeah, it's quite minimalistic here, very open, which gives a lot of breathing room. And at its own right now, it sounds kind of peaceful, which is not what I wanted. So I did a very simple thing to avoid that. And I did add 2 drones, just layered them. These are 4 layers of drones in total, because this is kind of a layered patch within Kontakt. And it's a very nice, distinct sound that I think works really well. I'm using Nightshade, C Nightshade for this. And together that gives a lot of tension. And this is a very subtle thing, but to make the piano a bit more interesting, I added this effect, which sounds... I'm just gonna turn it up a little bit for you. This is just this first piano note rendered out, and then just I played around with it. So reversed, pitch shifting, reverb, all that fun stuff. And together with the piano, it's... And now it's way too upfront. I wanted it to be very subtle thing. And then you have the... And I don't know, it feels like some background thing that's lingering there. It's quite subtle though. And we have the whole piano part here, which is kind of speaking for its own. As you can see, just nice open chords. And here we really start at the build, which is kind of the main thing about this track. So first of all, we have this whoosh sound that reverses like this into another whoosh and a boom. So this is just a basic transition, but it works really well for what it's trying to do. And then we also have this thing, which is also a subtle background thing. Let's just turn it up a bit so you can hear it more obvious. And in retrospect, I could have made it more obvious, but at the time, I wanted it to be more in the background. And I think it's still a nice call because it's just like a little Easter egg. And then we get here. And this part is where it's getting really fun. So the percussion at this point is not super interesting yet. We just have clocks going on with some... But not... Yeah, there's some delay on one of the clock sounds. As you can see, these are one of the more simple clocks. I rendered them out from Kontakt, which I think I did to align them better. Usually that's not really necessary because you can just compensate the delay, but I don't know what I was thinking. It was probably midnight when I was writing this. Yeah, it was. I have proof of that on my Instagram. Yeah, this has been a wild ride, this track. Anyways, this is kind of the main sound for the track. Like, it's some signature sounds are just there to fill up the atmosphere, and others are really there to kind of just like a melody would be, and then it's just part of the identity of the track. And that's this sound, which, as you can see, is just aggressive strings. I think this was from Arc 4? Arc 5. And then I pitch shifted it, going up, which creates a unique and cool sound, and then I just distorted the crap out of it. As you can see, I'm using pretty aggressive settings. Not super aggressive, but I did punish it, which is a bit aggressive. And then Volcano to make it darker. This is just a filter, you can use EQ for that. I just do this mostly for being more organized. So I know when the purpose of it is to EQ or to just filter something, because it makes it easier for me to know what I did there. And then there's Black Hole to create really large space and cinematic sound. And it's a pretty fun mood change. And then as well there's the boom that helps. Right now this is all empty, and it's pretty cool because that's gonna change. As you can see, some drums come in. I just wanna recap these drums a little bit. These are like small ethnic drums, something that I used in a few other tracks throughout the potion. Like Toxic Air and Where's My Home. So it's a cool way to... I really like this percussion, and it adds some unique flavor to the album. Like, this is really fun. So it just makes the percussion bed a bit more vibey. And here the piano comes in, which is something that I usually don't do as much. Just a reverse piano, that's simple transition effect. But what I'm talking about is with the piano, chord-wise, I'm playing the same chord, all hard quantized, changing, but back into the same chords. Small change. I think we call those passing notes, but again, don't lecture me on my music theory because I don't really know that. And basically I'm repeating the same piano thing for like a lot of times, and that's pretty weird for me to do. I like to change up the chords more, and especially because these are the same chords. But I felt like it was a really interesting thing because I managed to keep growing it by having a lot of weird stuff going on, as you can hear. That's coming in a bit. I also think it's a chord progression that's not as common because of how repetitive it is, but still with the interesting, let's just call them passing notes. So I think that's a pretty cool vibe that's going on here. And then we have this. This sound is wild. So what this is just a minor pad that's going on. It's like strings playing minor notes. It's a pretty performative patch. And I added reverb to that just to make it more cinematic. I thought it sounded really interesting. And the drone is still going on, just if you're curious, that's also going on in the background. And here we have the short strings, which sounds quite mystical. I didn't try to do realistic short strings here at all, but I did want a more subtle organic tone. So that's why I didn't do synths here, because often I do like a synth plug. I wanted to like change things up, what makes sense in the context of the track, and this still feels quite subtle, right? So you have that, which is pretty fun. Here, it's gonna get bigger too, but it's also still repetitive, which is was a really big challenge to make that work. And now we have the melody come in, which is it really melody? It's just some rich string playing that I Just did in the mouse and keyboard. The cool part about this, I think, is that when it comes in, you also have this ambience coming in. So you can really hear some sort of drama building up by having those two coming in at the same time. As well as, of course, the respace that's coming in here. The Hollow Knight respace, which is a preset, not by me. More strings, like doing weird stuff basically. And this is the cool part, where the kick comes in. But what's happening here, this was the part where I got extremely hyped about. I did forget to show you these. There's just some percussion building up as well. But that's very subtle. This is the part where we get sidechain on everything. So we have this, the bass, which is an obvious thing that happens with the kick and the bass, where the bass just does sidechain. What's less common is that the entire string section does that. So as you can hear, let's just listen to just the short strings. Because here, it's not really as obvious. But then with the melody, and that's where it just sounds extremely cool. This is such a crazy sound. And this was for me just experimentation. I had no idea that this was going to work out. I was just throwing a shaper box to do that sidechain sound on top of the strings. So it went on here. I automated it like the bypass, so it's turned on when we get to this point of the track. And it feels so weird, and I love it so much. Like this is just the vibe of the Poison. And then here I did some dissonant notes as well, as you can hear. But what's happening there is the piano also changes. Because this is the point where the piano changes. So let's just play that all together. I just really played with the structure of this track a lot. And this is also kind of nudging to that main melody idea. You see some disabled stuff, but I'm not using that, so if you get confused, don't be confused. Yeah, there's not much else that's going on. It's just, this is creating a huge vibe. These strings just pumping. Really fun. Now we have the little build up into the climax. And what's fun about this is I'm introducing this because this is used in quite a few points in my album. You can notice it, and it's still like a little bit different because it's also being pumped, because I just put a shaper box on the entire strings bus. And also another little whoosh effect, the same that I did over here, just copied that. And what's fun is that this thing, because it has a lot of reverb on it, it has shimmer on it, on max mix, so it's kind of insane. It's also pitch shifted down to create a more unique atmosphere from it. It just feels like the wind is kind of still going on, but you hear how it's also like being thrown at you. Together with the boom, that sounds really cool, I think. And at first I wasn't sure if I wanted to do that gap, but it works really well. It's not like I need to do a gap because there's going to be trailer editors or anything. Or it's just a personal track. But the gap is adding a bit of breathing space here for that to be taken away pretty quickly again. Little downer, but it's pretty subtle. Generally also not a great idea to have that as well as the boom. But to me it works. Because the downer has like the boom part cut off. So yeah. What's happening here is the big climax part where we have, which is just a crazy sound that's not really as noticeable, But what is pretty noticeable is that you're like going in, just like I did with the piano at the beginning here. What you notice is there's a single note, big block chords. And here I'm doing that in the orchestration. This is also what I did first before I did the piano. But it's pretty cool, I think, because you have this just the melody and then bam! The brass is basically synths here. It's not meant to be realistic brass, as with most of the Poison. I just tried to create that vibe of the brass, but I didn't want the brass to necessarily be realistically orchestrated. Whereas the strings, I took some more time to program that in a more realistic way. Not for the short strings with this track, but it's also not super dynamic, but it feels a bit more lush in the writing. But I have to say, the overall approach for this track was more EDM oriented than orchestral. I was just using most of the orchestral stuff, which is really a fun mindset to play around with. I'm just thinking about the sounds. There's this saw stack that works well together with the brass, and let's just also put the bass in there with a pretty aggressive bass. And just together with the strings. Let's just mute the short strings for now. Let's also mute the percussion and everything, the drums. At first I wasn't sure if I wanted to bring in rhythm, but I felt like you have this rhythm going on with the whole build-up. And I just tried it out and I thought it sounded pretty cool to have that same rhythm going on in the climax too. So I just kept doing that. Also with these. Which sounds more like a cool synth harp, but it's made with strings. Because they dance around with delays on there and everything. And then you have the kick drum, which is pretty fun. What I do have here with the percussion is that there's some more layers. There's these. But not like huge hard-hitting percussion. This is pretty subtle percussion. And we do get quite a bit of percussion coming in later. Like, to keep it more interesting, I thought it would be nice to have a little... Hear that small percussion? There's quite a few layers to that. We have this, which is by Monolith, which is a lot of the tribal percussion that I used throughout this album. Then there's the Dholak from India, which I thought sounded really nice. I did do some pretty massive EQ to it. And then with some clocks. And together all of that creates a pretty nice vibe. So they really work together. And for the hits, I tried those out. I just didn't keep them in. So yeah, they're all disabled. And yeah, so overall this part's pretty simple. The strings are also not super interesting. Like they just play the melody. Also just pretty hard drawn in. I didn't really spend the time to treat them to be super lush because it's all pretty synthy in general. Even though the strings, I did try to do some dynamics. With the brass, it's more like just really big blocks. But yeah, I think it's really nice to kind of be purposeful about when you do that. And it's still mostly intuitive for me when I do this. It's just I try it out and then I just hear whether or not I want to go in a certain direction, and that just determines. I don't know how to kind of tell you how I did that because that's so intuitive. I think a big part of that is also just I listen to a lot of music. I've made a lot of music, and by doing a lot of music, you kind of develop some sort of intuition for that. And also, a big part of it is just the fantasy that you have when writing the music. There's these that are. There's these. And this. that's working more as a pad. And if you disable those, it's not taking away that much, but it is taking away a little bit of the fullness. So let's enable them again. You can especially hear it in the empty space, like here. And then we have this. The crescendo is done mostly with the brass, where we go up here. And that's a nice trick to use when you want to end a phrase. Instead of going down and going up, just going up to kind of crescendo that way. I also emphasize that with these. And then outro tie, which is the actual calming version where there's no dramatic drone going on. I felt like that would be a nice way to kind of finish this whole adventure that we just went on. I also changed up how the outro goes. And I did some pretty unique chord changes that I normally don't do as often, which here is where I modulate to a different key. Now we end here at the G. And it's a pretty big difference from where we came from, which is this. And then we have this as the end. So I think it's a really cool way to kind of establish the journey that we went on, like we descended into a new world. And for me, getting the outro right was important. I played around with a lot of different ideas for this, but this is what I stuck with. This chord change was an accident, but when I heard that, like I just misplayed it, then I heard, okay, that's actually really cool. And then I knew that's the direction that I wanted to take. And then here, it's this one. So I really like that. That was the walkthrough for the Descent. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Wishing you a great day, evening, day, night, whatever. Bye.